Shalom, and welcome to today's continuing International March of a Living webinar series with today's lecture entitled Telling the Story Through Art, Holocaust Art as a Primary Source by the Holocaust Educator Liz Elsby. We are joined today by participants from all over the globe, including North, Central, and South America, Europe, South Africa, Israel, Australia, and many other places. Welcome. The international makeup of today's webinar highlights the true beauty that is the International March of a Living. Since 1988, the International March of a Living has brought over 275,000 students and adults, both Jewish and non-Jewish, from over 40 countries around the globe to Poland and Israel on Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, and Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israel Independence Day. The International March of a Living serves as a call to action for our thousands of alumni, for them to do their part to ensure a future free of anti-Semitism, racism, intolerance, hatred, and bigotry in all its forms. While we all continue to navigate the new normal that we find ourselves in, the International March of a Living remains dedicated to continuing its mission of educating about the horrors of the past to ensure a better future. We are here today to learn about a fascinating yet often unexplored topic, Holocaust art by the talented Liz Elsby. Liz made Aliya from the United States in 1984, and since 2006 has served as a Holocaust educator and museum guide at Yad Vashem. She brings educational tours to Poland, Prague, Terezin, and Berlin with various organizations, including the International March of a Living, as well as teaches about the Holocaust to teachers across the United States through Yad Vashem and Echoes and Reflections. In her spare time, Liz is also a children's book author and illustrator. She is currently working on illustrating a book about pre-war Krakow, as well as illustrating a series of poems written by the child poet Hanus Hachenberg, which she wrote while imprisoned in Terezin. Just a few housekeeping notes. We will give Liz the floor so that we can truly appreciate all that she has to teach us and save our questions and answers for the end. Please feel free to write your questions in the Q&A box at any point, and we'll do our best to get to all of them in the time allotted. I trust that you'll find today's lecture fascinating and eye-opening, as well as Liz's teaching style and overall demeanor to be warm and welcoming. Liz, I turn the virtual floor over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Liz, my Liz partner across the seas. Friends, first of all, thank you so much, everyone, for coming, especially our Israeli friends. I know it's kind of late here. It's 11:03, but I really appreciate everyone coming. Today, we're going to be talking about a subject that's very, very dear to my heart, and that subject is Holocaust art. Writers write, and artists express themselves through the visual. That's their language. And if we travel to Poland, and I suppose many of you have already been on March of the Living and have visited the places in Poland, it's very, very hard to go to a place like Warsaw or Auschwitz or Treblinka, where you just see the present, where you just see 2020, whatever year you went, and try to imagine the individual, how this affected human beings. We have photographs taken mainly by the Nazis. Those photographs often show us what they wanted us to see, what they wanted us to perceive their Jewish victims as being. For example, the photographs of people in Warsaw Ghetto, photographs from Auschwitz, and the Auschwitz album springs to mind. Artwork gives us a very different point of view. It gives us the human side. It gives us the side of the creator. Now, what do we consider Holocaust art? We're going to, for purposes today, anything written, anything created from 1933, the year the Nazis came to power, till about 1947 and 1948. And the reason 47, 48 is for those of you who are survivors, who are children or grandchildren of survivors, it takes 3, 4, 5 years till those people are actually back on their feet again, till they're beginning to see a new life. They've survived. They went to VP camps. They're finding a place to establish themselves. They're rebuilding families. So around 33 to 48, around the time also of the creation of the State of Israel. And one of the things, when we see a piece of Holocaust art, it's different than the same impact you can get by seeing a work by Picasso. I love Picasso, and if you know about Pablo Picasso, it kind of adds to how you can appreciate his work. When we see Holocaust art, we have to know, why is this Holocaust art? None of these people were born to be Holocaust artists. They were born to be human beings who are caught in this web of this horror that we call the Holocaust. And most of the people I will show you today, the majority did not survive. And we have to know who they were. Why, what's their story? How did this happen to them? How do they have the audacity and the strength and the creativity and the humanity to create art when the whole world is falling apart, when you're suffering, when starving, when you don't know what's happening, hiding? How do people have the humanity to create art? So we need to know about the artist, if possible. We need to know perhaps how it was created, if possible. And we need to know how it was found, what the story behind it being, found is. Sometimes we don't know any of that. So a little bit of a different way of looking at a piece of art. We have to know about the artist. Now, a lot of the artwork I'm going to show you today isn't exactly what you would consider, great masterpieces of art that would be hanging in the Louvre. Some of them are by incredibly skilled and talented artists. Some of them are by artists who we don't even know who they were. We just found their artwork, and their impetus to bear witness was so strong that they drew on whatever came to hand. Some of them were children, but all of them, for me, it's really an incredible act of resistance. And just having the opportunity to show it to you, I think gives them life again. Make sure that we don't forget them. And in many ways, for me, this artwork is the epitaph or even the tombstone that these people, most of them, never had. So with that being said, we are going to jump in. We're going to begin with this. By the way, friends, a lot of this artwork comes from the Ghetto Fighters Museum, United States Holocaust Museum, my museum, Yad Vashem, Bet Terezin, the Terezin House, etc. I will try and credit everyone whose artwork I'm going to be showing you, and some places have like a little watermark on the top. So if you see the orange watermark here, it's from the Ghetto Fighters House. Okay, we're going to begin with the terrible beginnings. So we're going to begin with this. The artist's name is Lea Grundig, and she was from Germany, from Dresden to be exact. She was born in 1906. She was a communist. She believed in, communist ideals in the 1930s. And she marries a man who wasn't Jewish, but was also a graphic designer and an artist. And as things began to get really bad, starting in 1933, and things gradually get worse and worse, step by step, she creates this piece of work called Thus Will It Be. And let's look at this together. It's an etching, which means it's a print. When you take a piece of metal and you scratch into it, and then there's a process that happens and you print and you get this type of work. What do we see here is all these footprints. We don't see people. We see a world that's kind of like populated only by footprints going nowhere, lost in the distance. It's a very uneasy etching. We know something's going to happen. People are going to disappear. Human beings are not going to be here shortly. And thus will it be. 1936, she's already kind of understanding that something terrible is happening and will continue to happen. Now, as we know, in 1936, it's not a lot of choice if you're living in Germany where you can go. Most countries in the world are beginning to slam their doors to desperate Jewish refugees. Not a lot of places will take in Jews. And she herself is arrested with her husband. She's arrested for communist activity. He's sent to Sachsenhausen, the terrible camp in Germany. She manages to get out. She comes to Palestine in 1938. She's actually on the infamous ship, the Patria, which was kind of a botched attempt to stop Jewish refugees from being sent by the British to the Mauritius. And a bomb goes off on the ship, and more than 200 people are killed. Thank God she wasn't one of them, very sadly. She's sent after that to Atlit, and then spends 8 years in Palestine, kind of like a ghost. She's making artwork. She's part of the Palestine Communist Party. And then in 1948, 48 and 49, she finally gets a chance to go back to Germany. She reunites with her husband, and she became the first professor in Dresden University, an art professor. So we're going to begin with work showing what's, you know, the storm coming, the darkness coming and settling on the world. And for that, to talk about this further, we're going to talk about another German artist. Whoa, back and up, back. And his name is Felix Newspam. And those of you who have been to Yad Vashem may have seen this famous painting hanging in our museum. Felix New Spam is from Osnabrück, Germany, very up and coming young artist, winning all kinds of awards. He's a German first, artist second, you know, an artist and a German, a Jew kind of second. And he gets a scholarship to study abroad, to study in Italy. And it's there in 1933, painting and really being part of the whole artistic milieu of the place. The Nazis come to power. He realizes at this point, I am no longer a German to these people. Now I'm just a Jew. And he goes into a kind of self-imposed exile, first to Italy and later on to Belgium. He'll be caught in 1942, I think, or 43, sent to a camp called Saint-Cyprien. He manages to escape. He escapes back to his wife, fellow refugee, Jewish Felka Platschek. And it's from there, the two of them are caught and sent to Auschwitz in 1944, and neither one of them survives. And he shows us here in 1939 what it meant to be a Jew with no country, what it meant to be a person who nobody wants, who was reviled, who was sent away. And if we look at this painting, we see this figure kind of hunched over in the chair. That's kind of an autobiographical figure. It's probably the artist. There he is in despair. He's bent over. Notice how uncomfortable that table makes us feel. It's kind of dwarfing him. And notice how the tippy tip point of this kind of very weird angle, this weird angle of the table is coming in and seems to be almost like poking him or piercing him on the head. If you look down near his feet, there is what you would see in Charlie Chaplin movies, the little wanderer, I forget what's called in English, like the hobo, the one who goes from one place to another, all their belongings in the little satchel, not really wanted anywhere. And it's kind of an allusion to the wandering Jew, the Jew who throughout history has not been wanted, who doesn't have a country of his own, who's been kicked from pillar to post. And if you look on the table, and it's not artistically accurate because you wouldn't have a shadow there, the shadow would be on the other side. But look how that globe is so menacing. There it is, it almost has a presence. It's looking at him, it's menacing, this huge globe. And notice it's becoming darker and darker and darker. 1939, this is a world where he is at this point not allowed to be part of. And in a few short years, will not allowed to live in, he'll be murdered. Darkness in the room, corners, there's no way to escape except for the left where there's a very weird archway. And if you look out the archway, which is the only way out, you'll see something that you might have noticed in the Okopowa Cemetery, those of you who have been to Warsaw, the motif of the dead tree, the tree with the branches that are bare, dead, and these birds flying in the sky. Now, art, the wonderful thing about art is it's open to interpretation. Some people interpret those birds as freedom, but in most of his artwork, and he's a prolific artist, he paints in hiding. He can't stop. He can't stop painting. He can't stop expressing himself. In his artwork, the birds always seem to be representative of birds representing death, something like crows flying in the sky. But again, what makes it artwork so incredible, I can tell you as an artist, I'll make artwork and people are allowed to interpret it the way they want. So you can interpret that as you will. But it's a picture that fills us with kind of despair. It's hopeless. Notice the colors, the brown, dark, despairing colors. 1939, you know, sometimes people ask me, why did the Jews leave? Where are they supposed to go? What were their options in 1939? Which countries would have taken them in? And the answer is almost none. Well, we're gonna head on over to Theresienstadt in German. which really was the largest. From 1941 to 1945, Terezin was a combination of concentration camp, ghetto, and transit camp. It has a reputation of being the better ghetto, the nicer ghetto, which I think is really undeserved. Conditions are better in this ghetto. However, remember, 88,000 Jewish people were deported. 140,000 people are thrown into this terrible place. 88,000 are deported to the east. Unlike what most of us believe, that they all went to Auschwitz, 42,000 of them went to places like Riga, to Mali Trotsinen. It's a terrible camp near Belarus, Minsk, Treblinka, Sobibor, Majdanek. And of those 42,000 who were sent away, 224 survived. And from 1942 onward, they were sent to Auschwitz. Now, in this camp, and those 42,000 who were sent away in that first year, 1942, the majority of them were Czech Jews. Really the long story of Czech Jewry, that beautiful history that kind of parallels Polish Jewish history. The same guy who discovered Poland, the same Jew who comes to Poland in the 9th century also goes to Prague. There's this great blending of all these rabbinical courts, there's all a very close connection up until modern history. And by the 1942-43, there was also huge arrivals of German Jews, Viennese Jews, Austrian Jews, excuse me, and a lot of elderly people. We're going to talk about that in a minute. The Nazis see these brilliant people and they decide we're going to use some of these people for our own ends. And we have all these artists. We're going to force them to create art for us. And they open up a few different studios. One of them is where they just make and copy paintings. And this one, which is called the Technical Studio, and you can see the artists here are being forced to make artwork for the Nazis. And we have some of this artwork. The Nazis loved charts. 1942, they want to prove to the big boys back in Berlin, look how profitable this ghetto is. Look how the people are working for us. So all kinds of charts, all kinds of technical things, which the artists also illustrate and try and make as beautiful as they can. Because when you're an artist and you have an opportunity to make a piece of art, you'll find an opportunity to put something of yourself on it. So here they are. But also look how crowded these poor people are. I mean, here they are, they're right on top of each other. If you've ever tried drawing or inking something and the person next to you is erasing, little bits of their eraser go into your ink, and it's hot, and these people are not being fed well. And here they are being forced to make art. At night, they do something extraordinary. They did not have the means to have an uprising like the Jews in almost 100 places in ghetto, in Warsaw, in Poland did. There was no way you could have had an uprising in this camp. The conditions weren't right for it. But their act of resistance was through their artwork. So the Nazis want this place to think, the world to think this is a better ghetto, that we're being better treated here. We're going to show the world what really happens here. And I'm going to show you some of that artwork in a minute. And I'm going to begin with one of them, who's really one of my heroes. His name is Bedřich Frita, who was born in 1906. He's born in what state? Czech Republic. And he's among the first men sent to this place to fix it up and get it ready for everybody right in November 1941. And he's showing us where he's being forced by the Nazis to show us what they did to prepare for the ghetto. And look at the beautiful conditions. They've got work suits on. Look at that nice wood. Everything is so clean. Everything is so neat. Everything is so orderly. But this is the artwork he makes for us in 2020. This is what the camp was really like. This is among the conditions. And one of the most bizarre things that happens in this camp, and this, you never know what leg you're standing on at a place like Terezin or any concentration camp, because the Nazis decide the Sudeten barracks, which has 5,000 men living in it, in cramped, horrible conditions, and they're living in, bunk beds that were created in November 1942. The conditions are bad as well. Anyway, And the Nazis arbitrarily decide in 1943 that they're going to turn this whole barracks with 5,000 people into an archive for their records. So the Jews are given 2 days to clear out. Where are you going to go? Tough luck. You find a place to go. And Frederick Fiete kind of shows the chaos of clearing the Sudeten barracks. Now look at the conditions. Look at how the place is slapped together. There's not those big fancy pieces of wood that you see in the Nazi propaganda. There's, you know, wood and broken wood and all kinds of crazy. Look at the people scurrying around in the streets. Some of them are taking pieces of wood from one place to the other, transporting furniture, transporting luggage, all of this going on. This is the real chaos. This is the uncertainty of Terezin, and he wants us to see it. Another one of my heroes is an artist called Haas, also from the former Czechoslovakia. And he's among the artists, a very good friend of Frederick Fiete and the other artists. And he's also forced to work, producing artwork by the Nazis, for the Nazis. And he is also a prolific recorder of what's actually going on in the ghetto. And these artworks I'm showing you here, even though they were made in 1966, are based upon drawings that he created in the ghetto. This is also called an aquatint. It's a type of printing process. And this one is called Next to Last Station, Auschwitz. And it comes from a whole folio he does of these works. Let's look at this together. Because if you do get a chance to see a cattle car when you're in Poland, which is probably the Radagast and Lodz, you don't see these scenes. When you're in Auschwitz and you see the car sitting there, Birkenau, excuse me, on the railway track, you don't see what happened in those cars. You don't see the humanity of what happened in the car, or lack of humanity on the place of the Nazis. It's a very interesting title. It's called Next to Last Station, Auschwitz. But it's obviously not Auschwitz, because we see here men who are kind of helping these poor old people get off the train. They're not wearing the uniforms of the Sonderkommando. They are wearing regular clothing. And Theresienstadt is often called the waiting room for Auschwitz. This is where you waited to be sent on to be murdered. And look at this scene. Here they are tumbling out of the cattle cars, terrible weather. Up until 1943, the summer, the cars didn't even come into Terezin. They went to a town called Bohusovice nad Odrze, and the people had to walk almost 3 kilometers. Look at these old depleted people with their luggage. They had to walk in all kinds of weather to the camp. Many of them did not make the walk. And here they are tumbling off the car in terrible condition. We see a little baby. If you look straight down here, there's a child holding a toy. And look at the stance of the SS man there. He's got a cigar hanging out of his mouth. He's not even noticing. He's warmly dressed. He's got his legs splayed. It's this kind of the power and these poor people tumbling in. Another one of his works he creates shows the opposite, the people being deported from Terezin. Again, we see them not leaving from the ghetto, from the trains that entered the ghetto, because that train track wasn't built until 1943. These people are being forced to walk to Bohusovice, and from there, they're going to get on cattle cars to be sent to the east. And what a sad procession. We see here the pregnant woman bent over. We see her, what must be her husband, this poor man, his face is lined with hardship. Look at the poor old people there. Look at the nurse and look at them struggling along. And there's a child looking at us. Now, he's the only one who's catching us in his glance. He's the only one looking at us. His face is very, he's giving us a look like, why is this happening? Why is this, why am I part of this? Why is this happening to us? In a way, he's kind of reminiscent of the child in the Rappaport Memorial that you see in front of the Polin Museum, the Ghetto Warsaw Uprising Memorial. Usually, people spend less time in the back, the people on that long procession to Treblinka, but he's looking at us. And it has a curious title. It's called SS Dog. And notice that the actual SS man is not the feature here. He's kind of in the background. He almost looks like Darth Vader. You can see him there in between the two elderly women. And the dog himself, again, open to interpretation, he seems to be as weary as the people are, to me. So the emphasis here is the dog, but who is the real inhuman one here? Who's the one who's forcing man's best friend to be the one to herd innocent people off, you know, to their fate? But again, we get such an essence and a feeling of this, these old people, these babies, these pregnant women. It doesn't matter to the Nazis. Just because they're Jews, they have to be deported and destroyed. And there's a subject that I find very, very important that is also very overlooked in Holocaust commemoration, and that's the plight of old people. No, it's, they didn't, most of them, the ones who were sent to Terezin from Germany and Austria, the majority of these elderly people did not survive. They don't leave behind anything. They don't leave behind a testimony. It's as if they never existed. And I want to put a little emphasis on their story in Terezin. And first of all, here is one of the, if you want to know what the charts were that these artists were being forced to create for the Nazis, this one is by a brilliant artist called Petra Ginz, who was murdered at the age of 25 in Auschwitz. And it shows us the age distribution of people in Terezin. Now, 1942, remember, beginning in February 1942, deportations had already been taking place to the east. That's when a huge majority of Czech Jews, 42,000 of them, are sent away to be murdered in places like Malý Trostinec, Sobibor, Izbica, Riga, etc. And in the summer of 1942, the Nazis start to deport elderly people from Germany and Austria. So the proportions here, for this little tiny place, and you can walk around Terezin ghetto in like 10 minutes, it's a few streets. So we have here on the bottom, 0 to 15-year-old people. There's 2,761 children in the ghetto at this point. There are 17,715 people of the age 16 and 55. And over the age of 66, it says 32,788 people. And it gets to the point by September, October 1942, there's too many old people in the ghetto. Too many old people who aren't producing enough, who are a burden. And we're going to see what happens to them in a minute. Now, how do they get there? Well, in Germany, they have to sign what's called a house, something like that. The translation in English is a house place purchase contract, which means you actually have to buy your place in Terezin and contribute money to help everyone else. And for that, you are guaranteed a house, you're guaranteed laundry, you're guaranteed medical help, you're guaranteed meals. However, there's a little disclosure there that says, if we can't give you these things, okay, too bad. And these poor people are forced to sign this seemingly legal document, promising them, you know, something comfortable at the other end. And in places like Berlin, they're taken to Miete, to a place called Grosse Hamburger Straße. They're stuck in a building till they get enough elderly people together. And then they have to walk around 8 kilometers through the city of Berlin to, I think, 3 or 4 train stations at different periods where they are shipped off to Terezin. Once they arrive, you saw in the other artwork, this terrible arrival. They're put into, after spending time in a place where they're robbed and they're kind of forced to wait, they're mainly put into attics, 4 or 5 floors up with no heating, no electricity, no medical care, these old, lonely people. And in 1942, they start to deport in what's called the Alte Transporte, 10 transports of these people to Treblinka. And there's an artist called Moritz Müller who does something very, very human and I think so beautiful. He was an art dealer in Prague, quite a arty fellow. He was quite established in the art scene in Prague. And when he's sent to Terezin, he starts to work in a hospital for elderly people with kidney and urine tract infections, something that you don't get over without medicine. And he kind of dedicates himself to these elderly people and painting. And he wants to show them one last glimpse of them as dignified human beings before they kind of die and disappear and are not remembered. And the body of his work, he creates in Terezin over 500 drawings and paintings. And many, many, many of them are of these elderly people. And you can see here in this beautiful drawing, which he must have been doing sitting by the bedside. He shows a humanity. This is a human being. This is not just some old person who came from Germany, who probably only speaks German, doesn't really have any connection to Czech culture. It's going to die soon anyway. What a burden. He sees them as human beings. And here's another one, Hans Cowder from Vienna in 1943. Some of them he actually records the names of the people so we know who they were. It's an incredible act of humanity. It's very loving that he would go and spend so much time drawing these people. Now, I did some research, tried to find photographs of, as many elderly people from Germany that I could who were deported to Terezin. It's very difficult. A lot of these people had lives, had everything before. All of that was destroyed, taken away, and there's really nothing left to show that they existed. And Aliya, who, by the way, she and her husband donated a lot of the artwork that we are seeing here, donated it to museums in Israel. She says this: these old people were really a nightmare to all of us. She's a teenager at the time. They were the ones who were starving the most, had the worst dwellings, were sick continuously, and were naturally dying. Every day, scores of them died. We saw them sitting around on benches, dressed in their city clothes with hats and knitted gloves, somehow pretending to live a normal life. It was all so pathetic and horrible to see them sitting there, engaged in conversation, formally addressing each other as Herr Professor and Frau Doctor. They were all lonely here. Their families had either emigrated or had been deported. When I have nightmares, it's just about these old people. They were completely lost. Charlotta Borsova, who was a brilliant female artist, survives the war. She makes this drawing that kind of gives us an idea what the living conditions are like in Terezin. And it's Mr. Schauer visits his wife, 1942. Now, what's amazing about this picture, besides the fact we see the overcrowding, he's 76 and she's 75. I think actually he's 77 and she's 76. These are people who deserve this years in their lives to be comforted, to be taken care of. And here they are in this terrible place with no privacy, suitcases all over to remind them that it's just, a temporary stay. They're going to be shipped off somewhere else. And when you actually see the drawing in person, the suitcase that she is leaning up against, he actually puts the name of the couple on the suitcase. And we were able to research and find out exactly that their fate was the fate of about 10,000 other elderly people. In October 1942, they were deported to Treblinka and murdered. And this drawing by Bedřich Frita is so powerful, before the transport. And look at it together with me. We have this one little old lady, elderly woman, all by herself, sitting on her little piccolo with her little bundles. We don't see her face so much, it's obscured in shadow. The light is kind of hitting her chest, showing us this Jewish star here in her last moments in Terezin before she's shipped off. She's still seen as nothing more than a number, a star. Her hands are useless sitting in her lap. It's a very painful depiction. Notice he doesn't really care if it's accurate with the shadows or not. He really must have that feeling of this kind of hopelessness, this lost woman off to be sent away. And here, one more picture by Leo Haas. You could see the conditions. This one is called Typhus Ss Transport, 1942. The year so many of those elderly people came in. Look at them thrown off the train like logs. Some of them are dead, some of them are dying, thrown onto these logs, into this truck, probably going to be shoved into, third floor somewhere, and they're spread their typhus and will probably die there. By the way, I just wanted to show you, I don't usually show graphs, but I just know that something that we don't talk about, it's kind of neglected when we go to Treblinka, to mention these transports that came from Theresienstadt. And I just want to show you, this is one transport, BP, which went in 21st September 1942. And let's see who was on this transport. The largest majority, this big brown part of the pie chart, were 1,343 women aged 61 to 83, I think it says, 85. That's 1,343 women that age. We have 37 women who were 46 to 60, 589 men, 61 to 85, 10 women above the age of 86, and 8 men above the age of 86. Only 1 Jew of Czech citizenship on the train. The rest were Germans and Austrians, and there were no survivors. Now, a fascinating thing with art is that sometimes more than one artist are predicting the same scene, are depicting the same scene, unbeknownst to each other. And these are invaluable sources of primary sources. Here we have different people reporting the same scenes. And one of them here that is a little known chapter in the history of also Terezin and also Poland, for those of you who have been to Bialystok, is a little deal the Nazis wanted to make. Some historians are not quite sure why. In 1943, following the uprising in Bialystok ghetto, it's August 1943, the uprising is failure. Most of the people are murdered or sent off to Treblinka. For reasons that we think to create a prisoner exchange, the Nazis let about 1,200 kids, kept them away from their parents. Imagine, these kids are traumatized. These are kids who had been through the ghetto. These are kids who had seen the horrors of the ghetto. And they decided they're going to take these kids for some weird reason to Theresienstadt, where they can be kind of like brought back to health somehow. And they would be used as a pawn, some historians think, as an exchange for German prisoners of war. And one of the plans was that these kids would be taken and sent to Palestine. Well, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem did not want 1,200 Jewish kids coming into Palestine from Europe, and he puts his foot down and no, these children are not coming. So the children were sent, after being in the ghetto for a few months and getting better conditions and a lot of love, the children were sent in October 5th, 1943, to Auschwitz. They arrived on Erev Yom Kippur, 1943, and all of them were sent immediately to the gas chambers. The 53 doctors and nurses who had been assigned to work with them or had volunteered to work with them in Terezin are also sent to be murdered. And we even know the name of their transport. It was DN and DNA. DN had 1,196 kids on it, and DNA had 53 caretakers. A shocking thing to remember. Now, people remember this as a very bizarre incident because, first of all, they were not allowed to see these kids. Who were they? Little kids, if you look on the left in this picture, are brought in under very heavy guard. These are just little children, 4 to 14. And they were taken, walked to the ghetto. People weren't allowed out to engage with them, talk to them. Obviously, the Nazis didn't want them to know that they had come from Bialystok. At that point, people knew about Treblinka, not anything they could do about it. They didn't want them to engage with them. So you can see here, we have this figure. She's wearing the uniform of someone who works in the disinfectant unit. And the children are being walked through Theresienstadt to take a shower. Now, these are kids who have been living in Bialystok, and when they hear the word shower, they get hysterical. They start screaming, "You can't wash us." The big ones are trying to protect the little ones. They're jostling each other. And through a lot of gentle prodding, they finally let themselves be showered. They were not actually housed within the walls of the ghetto. The Nazis created in a place called Krita, right outside the walls of the ghetto. They built some huts for them, and they were completely locked off from the ghetto until that final selection when they were sent to Auschwitz. Now, Freddie Hill, those of you who have learned about him, he's the youth leader who is an amazing young man. We can make a whole lecture only about him. He tries to climb into the compound where these kids are being held to find out what's happening, to hear some more information where they came from. And he's caught, and he's sent to Auschwitz, and he's sent to the Czech family camp there. So this is the impression of Leo Haas, the artist I've already told you about. This is an artist called Ernst Morgenstern, who was not a professional artist, but he felt so compelled to draw these scenes that he's seeing in Theresienstadt that he puts himself to drawing all of these very explicit drawings, really showing what's happening in the camp. He, I think, gave up art after he's liberated. He lived in Australia to the end of his life. Some of my Australian friends may have known him. Here he is. He shows us the same thing. Under heavy guard, these little ragamuffins, these little thin, emaciated Polish kids are coming in. And as they only spoke Polish and Yiddish, and as most of the people in the camp spoke Czech and German, most Czech Jews do not speak Yiddish. Even if they wanted to have some kind of dialogue with these kids, they couldn't have really done it. Pavel Fantal, another one of these very important artists from the ghetto. They're all important, very well-known, renowned artists. Here he shows the kids coming in 1943, the same drawing. Otto Unger, one of the great artists in this ghetto, also portrays the same kids. Helga Hoskova Vaisova, she's a 12-year-old girl when she's sent to the ghetto, and very talented young artist. And she starts drawing fantasy scenes. And her father tells her, don't draw that, draw what you see. Let the world know what we're experiencing. And she draws what she's seeing in the ghetto. And here she saws a transport of Polish children, 1943. So even this young child draws it. And you can see in the drawing, like all of the drawings, the police are holding people back from speaking to these kids. All right, that's really the fact that so many artists depict the same scene, I think is incredible. All right, we're going to briefly talk about Bedřich Frita, who we've talked about before, working as this art slave, having to make art for the Nazis, depicts himself as an art slave. You know, he didn't actually go work in a coal mine, but there he is, a man who's being forced to make art for the Nazis. But he didn't arrive at the ghetto alone. He arrives with his wife, Hansi, and his little boy, Tomi. And Tomi Frita was a young child. He was not quite a year old when he arrives in the ghetto. How do you make life normal for a little kid in a place like Terezin? And for his third birthday, his father had created a beautiful present for him. He wants to give him the present of like a future, the present of hope. And this is a drawing from this book he presents to his child, and it's his father and his mother, the artist Bedřich Frita and Hansi. And look at the Bedřich Frita for us. This is what we've been, forced to go through. This is what, and the Bedřich Frita for his little boy. Now, remember, Tomi I love this drawing. Look at the little tush looking out the window, the suitcase. We've seen similar suitcases when we go to Auschwitz. What do you give this little boy? He didn't know what chocolate tasted like. He had never seen a cow. He didn't know how cats felt. He didn't know what walking through a field barefoot, what a delicious crunchy apple tasted like. All he knew was the ghetto. And for his third birthday, his father gives him the gift of hope, of the world outside the ghetto that he will be part of one day. And even though there's a part where he says this train comes into the ghetto and we're going to get on that train, but that train's going to take us somewhere fantastic, he talks about what his little boy is going to do in this new world. Here he could be an engineer, he could be a detective, he could be an artist. Just don't be a general and don't be a banker, he tells his little boy, man's bohemian. He wonders what little girl he'll marry one day. Very sadly, neither of his parents lived to see his child get married to his wife Vera. Bedřich Frita was killed in the artist incident when 4 artists were captured in July 1944 for making horror propaganda. Them and their families are sent to the little fortress. Bedřich Frita was sent to Auschwitz, dies there of probably blood poisoning. His wife dies February 13th, 1945 in the little fortress, and he only survives, this little boy told me, because the wife of artist, Lea Haas, survives with him and protects him. And after the war, he's adopted by the only artist who survives, Lea Haas. And this little promise, this is just one of many books that Daddy will be making for you in his lifetime. And very sadly, shortly after this, his father was arrested, sent to the little fortress with the family, and then all 4 artists were sent to, I think 3 of them were sent to Auschwitz, and he died in Auschwitz. And Tomi Frita says, the only thing that remains to me, that belongs to me, that was made for me alone is my book, a book by my father. In that book, I could feel him, feel his tears, his hope, his fear. Okay, we're going to move on a little bit. I would love to talk about everything, but I could talk for 8 hours and nobody has time for that. I want to talk about, again, what we don't see when we go to Poland. When we walk the streets of Warsaw, it's a big modern city, and you really have to, try to stretch your imagination to try and imagine what life on living hell was like living there. We have a few sources that are incredibly important. And many of you have seen the movie, Who Will Write Our History, about Emanuel Ringelblum and the Ringelblum Archives, this initiative to save more than 30,000 pieces of testimony pertaining to the ghetto, and it's hidden under the ghetto, and it's found after the war and the ghetto ruins. And among the contributors to this archive were a few artists. And most of us talk about being hungry. And except for the survivors who are with us, we usually have the option to do something, to satiate that hunger. What does real hunger mean? And one of these artists, we only know his name and a little bit about him, Witold Levensson. We know that he studied in the Art Academy in Warsaw in the 1930s. He creates this series of drawings in the ghetto to show the horrors of the ghetto itself. And this drawing called Hunger. Now, I didn't cut it off. The feet aren't there. Let's look at it together. Look what happens to a human face, this child's face, when it's so ravaged by hunger. And look how she's attacking this piece of bread. And look how he doesn't want to draw this in a background. He wants the focus to be on this figure. This is hunger. This is what the streets look like. This is a man who's looking at it, feeling every single line, feeling this vision that he's putting on the canvas, on the paper. It's one of the strengths of artists. We have photographs taken by various Germans and Nazis in Warsaw Ghetto with kind of a barrier. They're taking pictures of the victims, but not relating to them as human beings, really, except one of few exceptions. Witold Levensson is feeling every line. He's feeling the suffering of this child. Another incredible drawing he makes is called Starving Child, created in 1942. That's not a portrait that you want of a child. This is a portrait of a human being, a young human being who's been reduced. And you've heard, many people in the ghetto talked about how starvation makes people have almost a face that looks almost simian. When all the skin begins to retreat from the bones, and there's muscles that make you have this almost smile. Look at this child's face, starving child, and look at the humanity in the eyes. Look at how we look at this child's eyes, and we can understand how the artist must have felt. This poor little thing, and he doesn't have food to give him, and he can't help him. And this is what Jewish children have been reduced to, dying on the streets of the ghetto. Incredibly powerful drawing. Witold Levensson himself, I couldn't find any evidence that he survived. He was probably just one of the, hundreds of thousands of Jews who died in the ghetto or sent to Treblinka. Another artist, and we talk about young people. It's a kid called Heinz Felix Geringer. He's from Holland. Kind of a wunderkind, brilliant little boy. He's a musician, and he's an artist, and he writes poetry. He has a little sister called Eva, who today is called Eva Schloss. Her mother married Otto Frank, so there was a connection between the families. When they had to go into hiding in Holland, she and her mother, who both had blonde hair, were able to go and hide in a place where they could leave and kind of sneak out. But Heinz and his dad go into hiding with a woman who will later on betray them. And just imagine a 16-year-old kid, 17-year-old kid, like Anne Frank, stuck in an attic. You can't make any noise. And all the stuff we know from Anne Frank, he's experienced the same thing. And his one relief is painting. And this is the painting of a 16 to 18-year-old boy. This is his world. This is the attic. This is, notice there's a pram here on the left. There's some paintings, there's some artwork. This is what he has to do every day with himself. And he and his dad try and draw as much as they can. Now, he told Eva, his sister, who would come and visit periodically with the mother, I'm going to hide all of my artwork under the floorboards. When I come back after the war, I'm going to pick the floorboards up and find my work again. Very sadly, the whole family, he and his father were denounced by the landlady, where they were in hiding. It happened on a day where his mother and sister Eva were also visiting. They were all sent to Auschwitz. Even her mother survives, and Heinz Gellinger probably died on the death march to Mauthausen. He didn't survive. After the war, she comes back and finds this artwork. Here's another one of his drawings. It's called this picture. Man, this kid is not seeing this scene. He's in an attic and he's painting pictures of freedom. He's painting pictures of his memory, of what he remembers. And you can imagine this bell tolling. What is it tolling? Is it tolling freedom? Is it tolling a new age? There's a little baby bird looking out. Maybe the baby bird is a symbol of renewal, of life beginning again. Extraordinary paintings by a teenager. Another teenager who was one of my idols, Petra Ginz from Czechoslovakia. He was born in 1928, a prodigious artist, a prolific, not prodigious, draws and paints and makes lino cuts and poetry. And he's in charge, he works with a whole bunch, it's a whole story about Petra Ginz. Please look him up. And in the more than 100 drawings, this brilliant teenager makes in the ghetto is this one that I find incredibly touching. It's called Flowers in a Window. That's Theresienstadt out the window. And there they are, you know, the beauty of these flowers, kind of, they have their own presence. They're looking out, and whoever could see them on the street, I think they offer a little bit of hope that behind these ghetto walls, behind everything that they're being subjected to, one day there'll be, you know, there's still beauty in the world. Poor Petra Ginz, brilliant young man, was murdered at the age of 16 in Auschwitz. Josef Richter is one of these artists, we don't know anything about him. We know that we don't know if he was Polish, we don't know that he was Jewish. We do know that he was a partisan and he was probably killed in 1943, and his artwork was found in a farmhouse near Chelm. That's all we know. But we do know that he had access to railways, and he was working in the area, we know if he was forced to work for the Nazis, near Sobibor. And he draws some of the only drawings, one of the only depictions we actually have of a witness from Sobibor. And he's so desperate to draw and show what he's seeing that he uses newspapers. He uses whatever comes to hand, and he writes on the back. So you can imagine this man, he sees something, and instead of just writing about it, he has to draw what he sees. And he writes here we see a figure. Now it's interesting because I looked up the Polish, and it says, like secret correspondence, it's something kind of, it's very strange when you see together with the picture. Here is the newspaper, the back is about the happy dentist, and he writes, small high window in a freight car, they ask for water, the guards are watchful, we are on a train on a parallel track, I draw slowly on a newspaper. He draws this drawing of possessions left behind along the railway track in Lublin, and I think what's so incredibly touching here is, look what people leave behind. Look what they took with them when they were deported to be murdered. We see talises, we see tefillin, we see children's toys, we see prayer books, we see, what do they call it? The thing you put on under your crutches. We've seen these things, not from Sobibor, but from Auschwitz. When we visit Auschwitz, when you go into the museum and you see these objects. But this is them, you know, as they're strewn about this railway station. The fact that Jews would still take their talit in that little tiny amount of bag that you can take, that you would still take your tefillin, and you would still take your siddur, and all these things that are part of your life, part of your Judaism, and that wouldn't be left behind. It would be there instead of your clothing, instead of something else. And here they are, just thrown on the thing, the people who threw them, the humanity of the people thrown away. He captures that. And he also draws Sobibor. Now at Yad Vashem, this is the illustration we use in our display about Sobibor, because we don't have photographs of the camp functioning. And he's there and he draws this, it's the only one he makes in color. And he writes in the back, the Sobibor camp, a high wall of plated dry stalks obscure the gas chambers, a rail spur enters behind the wall, only half of the train is concealed by it, the transport must be divided in two, unloading time, 20 minutes. Now, I hope she's here, but one of the really prolific, great artists of this time was a man called David Friedman. And you can see he lived from 1893 to 1980. And he was originally from Czechoslovakia, then he moves to Berlin, and then he comes back after he's no longer allowed to work in Berlin. He shows us what life was like as a Jew in pre-war Czechoslovakia and pre-war. There are incredible drawings, pre-war Germany. He shows us the whole process of what happened to him when he sent, and from Prague, 5 transports of Czech Jews are sent in the fall of 1941, September, October, to Lodz Ghetto. How many of you who visited Lodz Ghetto knew that almost 5,000 Czech Jews were sent there already in 1941, and of the 5,000 who were sent there, only about 200 survive. He sent to Auschwitz. He depicts the ghetto. He's an incredible artist. After the war, after he survives, and he lost his first family there. He lost his wife and his little girl, his first little girl, also called Miriam. He draws, when he comes to Eretz Yisrael, he draws Israeli views. He's this incredible artist. Of all his work is so prolific, and it's such an incredible window into what happened. This one really spoke to me. They all do. But I think as a woman and as a mother and as a human being who asks, how could you have done this? How could you stand there and kill people? And he makes this drawing in 1946 or 48. It's a series he created called Because They Were Jews. Look at the women here. Look at the eyes of these women. Look how they're looking at this man with his guns. And look at the shadowing and the light, and how the light is on these women, and these shadowy figures in the back. And how could they have done that? How could they have stood there and done nothing? These men who might have had their own children and their own wives at home, why these defenseless human beings are led off to be murdered. And you can really feel his anger. It's coming out through the work. And look at the expressions of those women. They are riveting. Looking at the Nazi, notice that the Nazi, we don't see his inside of his eyes. We don't see a very human expression. But I think they speak for all of us when we ask, how is that possible? And we're going back to the artist Leo Haas. He does this series in 1947, very shortly after he was trying to rebuild his life. And he shows us pictures from inside of Terezin and also in Auschwitz. And this may be familiar for all of those who are on the march. Here is the gate we walk under, the infamous Arbeit macht frei gate. We see Block 24, which was the brothel. These poor women, these were not Jewish women, they were Polish women, they were German women, all forced to do this job. We see the SS man there, we see the capo, we see someone hanging. He writes in the little blurbs he writes about each one of his works that this is a man who went insane and started running around screaming, and he's caught and he's hung for everyone to see. And here they are marching out to work. There's the orchestra. When you walk into Auschwitz 1 on the right-hand side, one of the first things you see is where the orchestra used to play. He was a witness. He saw all of this. And if he couldn't make this artwork when he was in Auschwitz, he wants the world to see it. This is what they did. This is what it was like. How much more time do we have? Let me just check. Oh, almost done. So I'm going to finish with this drawing, also by David Friedman, this painting. Because for those of you who have survivors in the family, and those of you who know survivors or may be survivors, 1945, 1946, it doesn't just happen that everyone goes home and finds a family and starts to live life again. Most people find out they have no home left. They have no place to go back to. Everything has been taken away from them. Everything has been destroyed. And he makes this painting of his second wife, Hilda, I believe her name is, who was also in Terezin. Tausig is the last name. Sees the horrors of Terezin, is also deported, also goes through these terrible experiences. And her attitude of lying there on this bed, look at her face. What do you do now? How do you find the energy to live again? How do you find the energy to go on when there's nothing to go on for? Very soon she'll be pregnant. So many of these young people were. How do you get married when there's no family members to come to your wedding? How do you raise a child? How do you do all of this stuff? How do you live again? And one of the things I find so incredible about survivors is where they found the humanity to want to live again, to want to create a life again, to live with those terrible memories, but still be a functional human being who could still try and find beauty in the world. And for me, this painting really sums that up. It's from 1946, and life will begin again. With all the pain and all the memories and all the trauma, life will begin again. And I'll just quickly end with this, because it's by a young man, 16-year-old kid called Yuda Bakon, who is still with us. And Yuda Bakon, to cut a long story short, originally from Czechoslovakia, survives Auschwitz. He is a very damaged, angry young man. He's lost his family. He's lived through the horrors of Auschwitz. He can't trust people anymore. What is there to live for? And he is taken in and given life again by an amazing educator called Frita, I'm having to sing the moment, can't remember his name. There we go, Pita. This happens when you're in your 50s. Anyway, Shimasol Pitter is an educator. He's a very devout Christian. He says the way you act as a Christian is not by going to church only. You have to bring your Christianity to the streets. You have to be a good human being. You have to help human beings. And to cut his very long and beautiful story short here, he brings this very broken little boy back to life through the sheer goodness, through his sheer energy, through his sheer love. And you can see him leading Yehuda Bakon, this broken 16-year-old, to the light, which happens to have a palm tree in it, which there aren't palm trees in Czechoslovakia or Czech Republic, but later, very shortly after, he will go to Israel, where he lives till today. There's kind of the dead self behind him. The Birkenau, the gas chamber is there on the right. But the title on the bottom is so beautiful. It says in Czech something like, "For the man who restored my faith in humanity." And Shimasol Pitter is considered a righteous among the nations. And we must remember that in the darkness, there were spots of light. There were people who were willing to be human beings, help other human beings, willing to risk everything. And we need to remember them as well. And so we have a teeny weeny little drawing by the 16-year-old kid who becomes a prominent Israeli artist. And I hope that I gave you a little glimpse today of the whole world of Holocaust art and how so beautifully it tells us the story. Okay.
Kol hakavod, Liz. Thank you so much for this intriguing tour of the world of Holocaust art. We know there's so much to learn, and you've just opened the door to so many of us. We've got a few questions in that I'd love to get if you have a few minutes.
Of course.
So one of the first is, how many pieces of artwork like this exist around the world?
That's an excellent question. I know that in Yad Vashem we have, I believe, somewhere from 10 to 13,000. Don't quote me, but in that range. But you must remember that most of the work that was created did not survive Holocaust. If it's from 1933 to 1948, so much of the work was destroyed. We have like the tip of the iceberg. There are great artists who created things that should have been seen and enjoyed and moved people that we'll never see. So there are collections, but it's not a lot.
And then for the ones that we do have, what are some of the various ways the artwork was found and then now is preserved? How is it preserved to be found?
Well, that's a great question. A lot of the artwork from Terezin was actually was hidden in the ghetto, was when the ghetto was found later on, because the ghetto itself was not like Warsaw. It wasn't destroyed, so there are like places that it could be hidden. Sometimes it was entrusted to a neighbor. Sometimes it was entrusted to a fellow prisoner. Sometimes, in the case of Felix Newspam, he sent some of the artwork to his father, who was also in Holland. And the artwork was, I think, preserved by neighbors and was found after the war. So there's different ways of finding it. Some of it that you saw from the Ringelblum archive was found in the boxes that were dug up in 1946 and 1950, 51, I can't remember the exact year. So that's how we have a lot of it. And imagine how much was lost.
Someone asked about the medium sculpture. Was any sculpture done?
Oh, that's a very good question. I think it was, but a lot of it hasn't been preserved. I know that in Yad Vashem, we do have incredible sculptures that were made after the war. One of them is, having a moment, I can't remember, I'll remember in a minute, because I actually interviewed him and went to his house in Tel Aviv and saw his sculptures. Survivor from Treblinka. Why can't I remember his name? Anyway, we'll write it down after. He, and his years later, he decided he was going to make a series of sculptures about his experiences in Treblinka. Incredibly powerful sculptures. There's a sculpture of a father helping his son take his shoes off before they're going to be murdered. There's a sculpture of the uprising in Treblinka. There's a sculpture of the man who was called the Scheissmaster, the shit master, excuse my language, the one who was dressed up like a clown in Treblinka, and he'd have to walk around with a clock. And he gives us a little glimpse of that life in Treblinka. Can't remember his name, sorry. So a lot of the sculptures I know are kind of post-Holocaust or 1945, 46, 47, in those years when they're rebuilding their lives.
Okay. Someone also asked if the Nazis ever commissioned portraits.
Yes, yes, indeed. And that was the way that a lot of survivors were able to survive, because in Theresienstadt and Auschwitz, a lot of the artwork we have from Auschwitz are artwork by Polish prisoners, because most Jews could not actually create in Auschwitz. They were murdered, the conditions weren't right. The Nazis actually set up an art studio in Auschwitz for Polish prisoners, and a lot of their assignments were, drawing these portraits. In Terezin also, artists were forced to draw portraits. It's a way of getting something for a piece of bread or, a cigarette. You have an incredibly brilliant, talented person making your portrait. So yes, there was examples of that. In Terezin, it was the way that some artists like Malvina Shalik had of keeping herself alive by drawing pictures of people in the ghetto and getting a piece of bread here or a little bit of something for these portraits. And it was actually a doctor who was a collaborator who asked for her to draw his portrait, and she refused, and he denounced her. And she was sent to Auschwitz and murdered.
It's very, very heartbreaking to hear all these stories, because behind every artwork there's a person and a name and a family that comes associated with that person.
That's right.
Someone wanted to know, was there any artwork done in the concentration camps or other death camps besides Terezin that has been found? And if so, where was it found?
Well, there is a wonderful Polish-Jewish artist called Halina Almutsky who survived. She creates artwork also in Warsaw Ghetto. In Auschwitz, because she's put to work, she's sent to Majdanek, and she actually works as I think she's painting signs or something in Majdanek. Artwork saves her again when she's sent to Auschwitz, and she's forced to create art. I think she's also painting or something, some artistic something in the ghetto. I think part of it is painting the inside of the barracks. Anyway, she's able to steal paper and pencil, and she draws a series of portraits of the fellow female inmates. And a lot of them are begging her, we don't think we're going to survive. Please, copy my face so that someone in the future will know that I once existed. So I think the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum has about 40 of those portraits done in Auschwitz. But in the other camps, Treblinka, Belzec, Sobibor, nothing. The conditions were not right for anyone to create anything, since most people were murdered upon arrival. There are some places like Sachsenhausen that you had artists. That's where Leo Haas was sent after. That's the terrible camp near Berlin. And the Nazis had a project called Operation Bernard to try and to make fake currency. If you saw the movie The Engravers, I think it's called, it came out a few years ago. It's about these artists who were forced to make this money that's supposed to flood Europe and destroy the monetary system. they used these brilliant artists to create artwork. Leo Haas, whose paintings we saw, drawings we saw, later on is forced to be part of Operation Bernard. And some of these artists also are drawing each other and drawing pictures, many of them anonymous, of the artists they're with. And we have artwork from Lodz Ghetto, David Friedman, but other artists are actually creating artwork in Lodz Ghetto. A lot of them are supplies by the Judenrat, which is making artwork showing the production. And also David Friedman makes this whole catalog of people working for the, in one of, they call them resorts, one of the little factories. So we have artwork from Lodz Ghetto, we have artwork from Kovno Ghetto, here and there, another ghetto, Kovno Ghetto, but most places we don't, most places it was destroyed.
For the educators that are in the audience today, they want to know, where can they find this content? Is it in museums? Is there any other websites that they could pull this up?
That's a great question. For me, it's a mitzvah also to see it. So first of all, look up David Friedman's work, and I think we will give a link to Miriam Friedman. We have a little link we could send everyone. Yad Vashem has a whole section, online exhibits about artwork. Ghetto Fighters Museum has a whole exhibit about artwork. United States Holocaust Museum, etc. I give a little talk about artwork you could use online. And also with Echoes and Reflections, we really address how teachers can use artwork. It's so powerful. And I think so many people are scared of artwork because they don't have degrees in art and they feel they can't talk about it. As you saw, this is artwork that's meant to be seen. It's meant to elicit a response. And what's so great for teachers is, there's no right and wrong when you look at a piece of artwork. When we saw that drawing by what's his name, by Felix New Spam, and we saw the outside with the trees, with the birds, he created the artwork, but we can interpret it in ways too. For many students, it's very liberating that you could talk about the Holocaust. You could talk about these things through the visual, and you can, be moved by it. So I think it's an incredible tool for teachers. Also, we can make sure that it's not the type of photographs we don't want students seeing, photographs, pictures of bodies, etc. We don't want to show children, piles of dead bodies in front of Bergen-Belsen, and it's not educational. It's the way of teaching the subject, using source materials that are easier for students.
Okay. I was going to end shortly, but a fascinating question just came in. I feel very compelled to ask. Was there any Holocaust art created by the Nazis? And if so, has that ever been shown side by side? It's a fascinating question.
That's a whole interesting question because, the Nazis kind of reestablished what art is supposed to be. Art is not supposed to be degenerate art. The great art movements of the 20th century, Expressionism and Cubism and all those things, that's not art. Art has to be, like all fascist countries, you can see Soviet art also. It has to kind of exalt the people and exalt the government and exalt families and all these ideals the Nazis were trying to sink into the heads of the German public. They actually have a show called Degenerate Art in 1938, showing some of the great artists of before the war. I think only 7 of them were Jewish, and it's put on the walls to have people spit at it and say, look how horrible the artwork is. And across the street, they had a hall of German art, which is so bleh, these big overblown naked figures and, it's a hotel art, or women who are, with children. And it's this really blasé. That's the type of art the Nazis kind of wanted to put forward. Now, Goering was a very, very smart guy. He buys up a lot of these great, abstract expressionist paintings, these great paintings of the early 20th century, and he kind of steals them. And some of them are sold. But as a whole genre, not so much. We do have a few examples that are kind of shocking. There's one example of a painting that was done on the back of a Torah scroll of a famous SS man whose name escapes me at the moment. But artwork basically had to be this artwork that kind of towed the Nazi party lines. You'll see the same thing in the Soviet Union. Whenever you have a government like the Nazis, the first thing to be suppressed is the human voice, is the human spirit, artwork, music, anything that's against their. So not so much. It's actually even hard to get these people to bear witness. If anyone who's read Ordinary Men, you know, these guys just didn't sit down and have an old chat with Christopher Browning. It's taken from the minutes of trials that they had in the 60s. So these people aren't forthcoming. It's not like they wanted to share their experiences like survivors wanted to.
Okay, I'm going to ask one last question because to all the people watching, it's actually past midnight for Liz, and we're so grateful that she did this process, especially at a time that's convenient to many.
I could talk for another 4 hours.
So I'll just ask one more question, but for those that didn't get their questions answered, feel free to email motl@motl.org and at motl@motlmail.org, and we'll try to get those questions directed to Liz and get them back to you. In addition, we will try to get to everybody that's been here today a list of all of the artworks and information about them so you can do further research on your own. So before we close, I'll ask you one final question that people have been asking. Is there a Holocaust art book or something for somebody that wants to learn more? Is there a text that people can go to now?
Well, that's a very good question. First of all, Yad Vashem, where did they put it? We have this book. We had an exhibit that we had in Germany, I think it was 3 years ago. It's called Art from the Holocaust, and it features over 100 works from Yad Vashem's collections. This beautiful book is from the Terezin Memorial, Art Against Death. There are all kinds of wonderful books about individual artists. There's a very famous book by Graham Greene, I think it's called, about the artists of Terezin. The Osnabrück Museum, which is dedicated only to Felix Newspam, has a beautiful, beautiful book about his work. So these are some of the more like come to mind works. A lot of individual artists have books about them. So I would suggest you do that. And if anyone also would like individual recommendations, I just said that's only one of my bookshelves. I have about 4 of them in the living room, and those are where I keep my art books. I'd be happy to give you some individual recommendations so you could really explore and kind of give them life again.
Thank you. Thank you, Liz, so much. This was a
thank you, everybody.
And we're getting so many messages that are coming through, thanking you and applauding the way your teaching style and how incredibly moving and personal you speak about all these artworks. So we're so incredibly grateful for your time.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Opening up this new world to us, and there's so much interest. Maybe we'll do part 2 one day.
I'm ready to do 2, 3, 4, and 5.
And for those asking, we will have a recording of this that we'll make available shortly. Thank you all of you for joining us. Please look out for more educational webinars, survivor speaker series, and fireside chats being offered by the March of a Living. Follow us on our website at motl.org and on our social media channels. In the meantime, we thank you, Liz. We thank you everyone for joining us, and we wish you all a safe Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Bye-bye, everyone. Bye, Liz.